Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you during this very special evening session to commemorate the executed army, Polish heroes who, after the Second World War, they were of course active also during all the awful years of the Second World War, but after 1945 decided to fight for the freedom of Poland. Pana Leszka Zebrowskiego w zasadzie
Leszek Zebrowski needs no introduction, as his lectures of the recent Polish history are so popular on the internet. Articles that he has written about the underground movement in Poland are also very popular. Some of the characters that he is describing in his work have become closer to your everyday experience. Mr. Zebrowski continues to be active in describing the so-called Second Underground Movement. He's a historian, a writer, but also a political activist, a politician. He participated in general election to the Polish National Parliament, the Sejm. He is a very important personage, particularly in those circles where the independence of Poland plays a very crucial role. May I call on Mr. Zebrowski to deliver a description of the way the forgotten army was organized. Over to you, Mr. Zebrowski.
Przyznaję, że z ogromną wdzięcznością I ze wzruszeniem przyjąłem zaproszenie.
I'd like to say that it was with huge satisfaction I accepted Madame Fotyga's invitation, because it was the period of the history in Poland. I started professional research of that area in 1980s, and back then I knew that knowledge will be knowledge within families, so will not leave family circles, there will be no such need to talk about it. And when I was talking to the last participants of these events, when I was getting photos or documents from them, it was something sane to me. There were sane objects. I knew it was important, but I didn't expect that it would happen what is happening right now in this patriotic revival. The patriotic ideals of the forgotten soldiers are alive again. Today we have the communists, people who wanted to wipe them out of this history, the enemies. So we need to talk about the historical context, who they were, what they wanted. The Second World War was a catastrophe for Poland. Poland was the first country to resist the evil, to resist the two totalitarian powers. We lost that war. We were alone. Poland was divided once again. The Soviet Union took over 52% of the Polish territory, and 30 million of Polish citizens. Germans took over 48% of the territory and 22 million Polish citizens. Poland ceased to exist. It was formally wiped out of the map of Europe. But Poles didn't surrender. A Polish government immigration was created, first in France, then in England. The Polish army, Polish armed forces were established, armed land forces, navy and air force. The Polish forces took part in the battles all around the world. They were protecting Norway, France, Great Britain. Polish soldiers were fighting Germans in Africa. And then, from 1940, they were liberating Western Europe and Italy. And those people were also forgotten, rejected. They could not return to Poland after the war. What was happening during the occupation was keeping the substance of the nation. Poland did not exist formally, but existed as an underground state with its underground justice, with an education system, with an army, the Home Army, and other organizations were joining the Home Army with time. There were also a civil structure of the underground state, the delegation of the government for Poland. So that was the main purpose, keeping the nation alive. This is how it was formulated by this delegation of the government. We couldn't allow ourselves for responsible action leading to even more losses with this level of extermination, both under German and until June 1941 under the Soviet occupation. It was most important to save our citizens, to save Poles. The people were ready for an uprising to come at the right moment. The uprising which was to be supported by the Western powers, because the idea was that the Allied Western forces will come to Poland. The same thing would happen that was happening in the West from June 1941. Everywhere where Allied forces were entering, people were crying, but they were crying from joy. That didn't happen in Poland. In Poland, the entry of Soviet forces on the 3rd of January 1944 also brought crying, but it was a crying of people who already experienced the first Soviet occupation. Repression started. Exile to Siberia, murders of Polish soldiers, those soldiers who did not want to be loyal to Stalin or Wanda Wasilewska were expelled to Siberia. The last soldier of the Polish army returned in 1991 from Siberia. So why don't we know? Why don't we talk about all of this? Why all that was not present in our history? The Soviets had a ready-made plane. They were not our ally. They were an ally of our allies. It is a very strange situation. They thought that the areas that were took over in 1939 will be there forever. And from the remaining area, they established a country that was supposedly free, but was fully dependent, fully controlled by the Soviets. That was the People's Republic of Poland. And there were also repressions. There was persecution in the entire country, and that resulted in resistance of those who survived, who were underground, but they could not leave the underground, because living underground meant prison or even death. So at the moment when a resistance starts at the entry of the Red Army from the east, this is the beginning of the last great Polish uprising, the anti-communist uprising. And I hope this name and the history of that uprising will be duly described in our history textbook. There will be something clear to everyone. We'll talk about that uprising just like we talk about all the others, like the January uprising. There were two goals of the Polish underground fighters. It was not frontal fighting. Poles could not fight the Red Army with millions of soldiers. It wouldn't make any sense. But it was about self-defense. It was freeing prisons, destroying prisons, freeing those who were to be executed or transported to Siberia, where the execution was simply postponed. It was bound to happen. The most important action was the destruction of the concentration camp number 10 in Grębentów next to Warsaw, the concentration camp of the secret police. Many people say that this name is not true. Yes, it was. This is how it was called in the documentation, concentration camps of the KGB. A few dozens of political prisoners were liberated, and they they stayed alive. Such events in 1944, 1945 and later were plenty. On the other hand, it was self-defense against destruction, but pacifications of the carried out by the internal troops of the KGB. We don't know much about it. In 1944, in August, next to Surkonte, a group of the Home Army of the Novograd area, led by Colonel Maciej Kalenkiewicz, Nomdeger Maciej Kalenkiewicz, they fought the last fight. Wounded people were not spared. Nurses and couriers were not spared. Those people were killed with bayonets. We have to think about the Polish Thermopyle. When it was clear that the Polish underground stayed in its civil structures, that is the delegation of the government, and as far as its military structure is concerned, is known to the Soviet Secret Service, that the losses are too high. At that point, everything had to be reorganized, and this happened. After the dissolution of Home Army of the 19th of January 1945, new organizations of the underground organization were launched. Freedom and Independence and the National Military Alliance. They were the major ones, but there were many smaller local ones who they began the struggle for independence against the communist occupation. The extraterritorial areas, departments of the Home Army from the east, from the Stanisławów area, or Tarnopol, or Lviv area, or Vilnius area, they continue their activities on the territory of the People's Party. Then the Wielkopolska volunteer group Warta, based on the dissolved Poznań department of the Home Army, underground Polish army. Even most Poles don't know these names, and we have to remember about those people. All these structures were subordinated to the Polish government in exile and to the chief of staff. These were Polish organizations who fought for independence. It is very special about these structures that for many years after the war there were many youth organizations, young generations who couldn't take part in the struggle, in the fight during the occupation, during World War II. They were also joining the underground army, political groups, students group, civil military groups, scouts groups. So what it was about, what these people wanted, it was not because they were young, they wanted to do some shooting. They wanted to live normal lives. They wanted to leave the underground army. They thought that they deserve what the Western societies did get, an independent, free life. Jerzy Braun, the last delegate of the government for Poland, in the testament in the will of the fighting nation, he made a list of what these people were fighting for. And we have to stress the demands. The departure of Soviet army and Soviet secret police from the territory of Poland, free political parties and the participation in elections, full self-government in the area of education, social life, economy, and also a democratic, patriotic education based on morals and based on European moral principles. This is something which is obvious for any society, which we normally don't have to demand, don't have to ask for, but those people did have to fight for it. Similar orders were formulated by military structures. The heads of that uprising formulated military orders, so making them general. They were indicating the general purpose, and they were giving the people a perspective, even if it was very distant. Colonel Danielewicz, Doman, the head of the National Military Alliance, in an order from July 1946, said, "The struggle of the Polish nations for basic rights of development of life is continued, will be difficult, and will be fought for what is the essence of the nation. The culture, religion, tradition, independence of thought and of the Polish spirit will be the struggle against the communism and the influence of the East. In that fight, all of you have to take part. It will be continued until we achieve the goals which were set at its beginning, that is the creation of a sovereign Polish state with all its areas, with its borders on the west, which will provide conditions for the development of the Polish nation." This is something really special. Those people did have a plan. They had a perspective. They were believing that they have to win, that if they don't make it, then it will be the next generation. That is, in fact, us, those people who were entering the society in the 1980s, who were struggling, fighting the communists with other methods. So that dream was fulfilled. A special feature of that uprising is what happened in northeast with natural conditions, with huge forest complexes. Resistance was continued until 1950s there. Much of that is forgotten, but we are remembering today. That tradition is still alive. Who was there? Who was doing what? Those people knew very well what they are losing and what the consequences will be for them. This anti-communist uprising until 1945 had some 200 up to 250,000 participants. A few dozen thousands were taking part in the guerrilla fighting, were members of the guerrilla troops, except for those who were formerly members of different organizations. There were people, there were civilians who were supporting them. Without the help of the civilians, of their care, without it, that uprising would have lasted only a few days. Those people had to eat something, had to rest somewhere. They had to know what was happening in the area. Without the support of the civil population, millions of Poles, very often for just giving a glass of water, showing, "Don't go there," just for that they were sentenced to 5 or 10 years in prison. And they were sent to that prison, but still they were helping their own people because they were defending them. The communists, the representatives of the communist Poland, called People's Republic of Poland, they knew they mean nothing. Without the Red Army, without Stalin's forces, they didn't stand any chance. Gomułka, alias Kowalski, said clearly, "We are not able to fight with the reactionary forces without Red Army." Franciszek Jóźwiak, the head of the communist militia force, said even more. He said, "We are not in our areas. Soviet battalions are fighting for us." And over the entire period of the communist Poland, the communists knew very well what the real situation was. The last head of the internal security force, there was the military force of the KGB, Włodzimierz Muś, in 1989, he did say that yes, we, the Polish communists, were supported by the Red Army. Otherwise, it would have been defeated. They were more organized, they had better tactics, they had a great support of the population, they had better training, they had better people. So this is a very clear, very telling statement on the side of those who betrayed Poland. They were not hiding who they really were, what the situation really was. The losses during that uprising were really tragic. More than 12,000 insurgents died, through crimes and in prisons, in secret or non-secret executions outside of prisons. A few dozen thousands of independence fighters were killed or executed. The Soviet actions, the actions of the communist Polish militia, these were the forces of 100 up to 150 troops. So many of those people were killed, and often they were buried somewhere without any tomb. Today on their graves there are streets, there are residential areas. So it's thanks to Mr. Szwagrzyn and people like him we can find some of this, we can identify them. But we have to remember about tens of thousands of people who would most likely never be found. Punishment, severe punishment by the communist courts. They were not sentenced to death once. Mr. Łupaszko, the commander, was sentenced to death 18th time. Jan Fiołek, Mazurek Wir, the commander of the National Military Assembly in Northern Mazovia, he was sentenced to death 28 times. Victor Sergeant Stryjewski, Cacko, from the Northern Mazovia, commander of guerrilla troops of the National Military Assembly, was sentenced to death 38 times. This is really impressive even today. It is difficult to think about the fate of the families of these peoples and how their children were treated. The youngest political prisoner in Poland, arrested for the first time, Janusz Żubryd, was 3 years old, 3 years and 7 months old. He was not sent to prison alone because he was arrested together with his grandmother. He was arrested again in April 1946, shortly before Easter, together with his aunt and grandmother. He was 4.5 years old, and he was formally sentenced. It was not like he was only arrested. Supporting the Żubryda troop led by his father. That was the charge for a 4.5-year-old child. Magdalena Zarzycka was born in May 1949 in communist prison. The mother, tortured in prison, gave birth prematurely, and the child, for 2 months and 3 months, was staying in communist prison because it was passed on to an orphan house. The last Józef Franczak, the last insurgent, Lalek, was killed on 21st of October 1963. And this is the formal end of that uprising. Of course, it was slowly disappearing, was being dissolved earlier, but even after his death, there were people, the last ones who were hiding somewhere, were arrested.
Now, similarly to other Polish uprisings, there are still some people who were hiding. Now, we are discussing this topic in Brussels, but we're fully aware of the fact that they are actually having their last victory and they're coming back to us.